Hi, it's Monday and we're talking about boundaries. Um, whew, people, I did not know how much we needed to talk about boundaries. I thought I did, which is why I came up with this topic after talking to some of my coaching clients and some of my friends. But one little post on introduction to boundaries, and you all were like, let's talk more about boundaries. So that's what we're going to do. Today, I want to talk about types of boundaries, and I want to talk about some misconceptions and challenges that come up when we start setting boundaries. And then in future weeks, we'll talk about how to set them, how to enforce boundaries, etc. So stay with me, folks. So, I think that I had a misconception that there are really two types of boundaries. There's sort of personal boundaries and professional boundaries, when in fact, I couldn't be more wrong. As I started doing research about boundaries, I realized that the list of types of boundaries is extensive and that there's no way I could cover it all. So in my blog today at leahfarmer.com, I list quite a few different types of boundaries and what they mean, but even that is not an extensive list. So I want to address a few, and then I want to leave you to maybe bring some of your questions to me or do some of your own research. So obviously, there are things like physical boundaries. So physical boundaries is like agency over my own body, my personal space, touch, privacy. It's really the way that we preserve a sense of safety and autonomy around this physical dwelling that we live in. Adjacent to that is obviously also sexual boundaries, like what am I comfortable doing with my intimate partners? What am I not comfortable doing with my intimate partners? And this particular topic is really loaded, and so I'm going to be very cautious in how I approach it. Many of you know that I come from a background of pretty extensive abuse, and so there can be some triggers in here. And so I want to avoid them today, although I would always be open to discussing that with you if you reach out to me. The bottom line is, while there are people who will violate your physical boundaries, one of the first steps for ensuring that people who don't want to violate your physical boundaries know them is for you to know them. What are you comfortable with in terms of physical touch, and with whom? And what are you comfortable with in terms of intimate and sexual touch, and with whom? And how do you communicate that? How do you articulate that? Super, super key that we just quite frankly talk about what that looks like. I have to say that I think parents now are doing a far better job talking to their kids about what constitutes the boundary of their physical body and how much ownership they have over it. But I also think it's just a really hard topic. It's a hard topic when we're teaching little ones. It's a hard topic when we're grown-ass adults. So I just want to call out that this one is so important, that you understand what your boundaries are and what it would look like for you to move the fence if you choose to, right? So that's one type of boundary. There are also things like emotional boundaries and intellectual boundaries. So emotional boundaries are going to be how we process and discuss our own emotions, and how we acknowledge the boundaries of other people's emotional health and intelligence, right? This helps us to really establish an understanding of how to use empathy, how to use self-care, and how to navigate relationships with compassion and integrity and emotional well-being. So there are boundaries around our emotions, and we need to be very, very clear on that and figure out what those are. Intellectual boundaries are going to be, how do we respect and value one another's thoughts and ideas? We don't have to agree, and often we are not going to agree, but I need to figure out what is the boundary that I have around having my thoughts and ideas respected and valued, even if they differ from yours. And what does that look like? What does that intellectual boundary look like? And then obviously there are things like professional boundaries. Professional boundaries are, listen, this is how I interact in the workplace. This is how I manage my time. This is my workload. This is my communication. And how I take on new work, how I say no when I have too much. And having good professional boundaries enables us to not get to a level of burnout or overwhelm that hinders our professional growth. As a leader, I just want to call this out. As leaders, Often you are not only responsible for the professional boundaries of yourself, you are looking at the professional boundaries for your team. So if your teams are asked to do more than they can do, it is your responsibility to step in and say, listen, we can take that work on, but we would need to put something down. And what does that mean? Your boss may not like that. And that, my friend, is too damn bad. Because as a leader, one of the things you take on when you take that job is protecting the professional boundaries that your team has shared with you and constructed, your own and theirs. So I just want to call that out. Again, too damn bad if you don't like it. Don't be a leader. If you don't intend to establish, articulate, and promote healthy boundaries for yourself and your team, don't lead. That simple. There are also things like material boundaries, which this one was like, oh, yeah, of course. So where do you spend your money? How do you spend your money? How do you use credit? Where do you have frivolous buying? What do you consider frivolous buying? So material boundaries come up between people when someone says something like, oh, you pay for a housekeeper? Yes. Right? And yes, maybe, sometimes, yes. I would never do that. Okay, well, that is a material boundary. It could also be a physical boundary. Some people don't want someone else in their space. Totally get that. But those boundaries are important to understand that you may have a different material boundary than someone else. You may not want to spend money on eating out. Okay. You may think sharing at dinner is a good way to save money, and someone else may be like, get your paws off my French fries, right? So just something to note. There's also things like social media boundaries, time boundaries, health boundaries, spiritual boundaries. There's so many ways to navigate building a fence and saying, this is where my line is. While you probably can tell there's a lot of overlap of all these things, these different kinds of boundaries, I think one thing that is true for most people who are really struggling to set boundaries is the challenge that can come with setting boundaries really for the first time. Many of us fear rejection and hurting someone else's feelings when we set boundaries. And I understand that. And yet they are necessary. Boundaries, as I said last week, are not an act of selfishness. They are an act of respect. Self-respect and other respect. I respect myself enough to tell you what my boundaries are, and I respect you enough to give you the information so that you can respect my boundaries. So, because that will create a healthy interaction between us. And so that's super, super important when we're talking about boundaries. There's also a problem that we're going to address starting next week. It's lack of awareness of what your boundaries are. If I've talked to people and said, well, do you know what your boundary is there? No, I don't. I just know that I want to have one. Awesome. That's great. I'm glad you want to have one, and we need to figure out what it is, because if you don't know, then no one else does. So I liken this to the many arguments among people over the years where someone has said, if you don't know, I'm not going to tell you, or don't pretend like you don't know what we're arguing about. Listen, we all interact with lots of people and lots of different mediums every day. And sometimes you don't know what the other person's mad about. And so asking people to be mind readers about your boundaries, it's a recipe for disaster and for having people on the inside of your fence way too close. So we will talk about what it looks like to build boundaries, to start having boundaries, and what it looks like to enforce and be consistent about boundaries in the coming weeks. But I do want to just say having boundaries is going to require you to decide what those are. I can't decide them for you. You can't decide them for me. I can help you. I can help you articulate them. I can help you talk about them. I can help you define them. But I can't set your boundary, and I cannot consistently enforce your boundary. So that's boundaries for this week. I know it was a little long, but I think it's important. We'll dive into setting and enforcing in the coming weeks. And then I just wanted to say if you are trying to set boundaries and you would like some help, if you would like a partner, if you would like someone to discuss why you're struggling to do it with, happy to do that. For those of you who know me, you probably are like, yeah, Leah enforces boundaries. She's good at that. I wasn't always. So let's be clear. I used to get run over a lot. And I would do things out of fear of rejection or hurting feelings a lot. Whereas now I'm a big believer in Brene Brown's statement that clear is kind and unclear is unkind. And so I need to be clear about my boundaries and then ask you to help me maintain them and ask you what yours are. So, really excited to have this conversation, really excited to keep talking to you about this. Would be absolutely happy to partner with you on this topic. So go to my blog, leahfarmer.com, and check out today's blog on this topic, and I will be back next week with more.